The truth is that the public regard Brexit as a sort of dirty, great mess, a great pile of poo that's sort of left in the corner, which they don't want to go anywhere near and don't know what to do about.
From the people who brought you.
I have an appointment with Her Majesty the Queen in a few moments to tender my resignation.
A new dawn has broken, has it not?
Until today, we were rivals, and now we're colleagues.
The big budget blockbuster podcast featuring Tory brainbox Daniel Finkelstein.
It doesn't matter.
Nick Clegg's Polly Mackenzie.
I think people should get votes from birth.
And the comeback kid Peter Mandelson is back. And this time it's personal.
Keir Starmer needs to shed a few pounds, and that would be an improvement.
How to win an election reaches 1 million listens.
What do we think of the new cinematic version of the theme tune? Robert Groves. He's done all this himself. I think it sounds like a Spielberg film.
Yeah, I was thinking, 2001: Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
That's the.
Bit E.T.,
That's obviously
bit
not
John
Spielberg.
Williams. Yeah.
I thought you said that we were never going to mention that thing about Keir Starmer losing a few pounds again.
Did we?
Yeah, I thought
I don't. Hang on, let me just check my contract. No, there's definitely nothing in there. Yes. Anyway, it's very exciting. We've passed 1 million downloads.
Well done, Matt. Congratulations.
Well, no, well done, you, Peter.
Oh, no. Well done, Polly.
It's all for me.
I think it's all Polly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And obviously Danny. Danny
Yeah.
just saying the same thing. In fact, Danny's only been on the episode once. We've just kicked him up saying nothing matters. So we've just played it.
Nothing will make a difference.
Nothing will get any difference. So we've just played it at random points.
That's what we really need is the Bohemian Rhapsody version of the theme tune, isn't it?
Nothing really matters. Oh, that's what we need.
Oh.
Yeah. Can we get Danny to sing the whole of Bohemian Rhapsody? We'll give it a go. If you want to get in touch, email us howtowin@thetimes.co.uk. Howtowin@thetimes.co.uk. And if you want to have a go at the theme tune, we've had a different one as well, which sounds like a ringtone. We'll maybe use that on Friday because it's quite a tough listen. If you want to get in touch, howtowin@thetimes.co.uk, and we can send you we'll send you the sheet music as well. But anyway, if you have been one of the 1 million downloads, thanks so much for downloading. Right, let's kick off with this question sent in by listener David.
Hi team, David here from Belgium. I was wondering where the shock's going to come in the appointment of Keir Starmer's cabinet. One assumes that Rachel Reeves is safe, but is David Lammy under threat from a returning Douglas Alexander, or even Tony Blair from the Lords? Or will this be the moment when Starmer shows he was a real Corbynista after all, and brings back John McDonnell? Thanks all.
Peter's face at the idea of a comeback for John
First,
McDonnell.
I don't think there's any reason there has to be a shock, right? It's perfectly possible that in the interests of continuity and stability and people having a general sense of knowing what they're doing in the first 100 days, that they will just stick with what they've got. I mean, no guarantee of that, of course. Lots of prime ministers do make a change. But, David Cameron had planned basically to keep everyone in post for those reasons. And, and the individual ministers had those contact meetings, they had detailed plans for their departments. So maybe it will just be, as Keir Starmer has promised us, he will be a boring prime minister and he will not shock anyone. But obviously the real shock appointment would be Peter.
Yes, now
and
we're
we're
talking.
trying to see whether he's blushing and he's gone completely still. I think.
Will you, end of next week, be waiting by the phone,
That's his
Peter?
poker face.
Dead pan. No, I'm reliably informed that I will, not be brought back into the. So
that's been made quite clear.
That has been made absolutely
That's
clear.
for the dying embers of the Starmer regime in 37 years.
Yeah, come back to rescue him.
They don't want any big beasts coming back to mark anyone's homework. No, I would say that Rachel Reeves, dead cert.
Yeah.
Should Labour be elected and be given the privilege to serve. David Lammy, absolutely dead cert at the Foreign Office, and I think other top jobs, no change.
So the reason of Douglas Alexander, of course, because he was in the cabinet, but you were in the cabinet.
Yes,
and
at the end. Yeah.
He is coming back as an MP, and so there's been some speculation, but you think it won't happen?
It won't happen now.
Danny,
Can
what do
I
you
ask
think?
though, Well, I mean, look, first of all, it is possible. Certainly that's what Tony Blair did with Frank Dobson. He moved people around in their portfolios just because he thought it was better for running the government than it had been for running the election campaign. So it's definitely possible. I don't think there's going to be anything huge. I guess I've always looked at the shadow cabinet and wondered if he'd persist with Yvette Cooper, only because she clearly did a job for him in terms of making his shadow cabinet look like it was preparing for government, and that's why he brought her in. But whether he would really need her in his inner circle as Home Secretary, I just don't know. It isn't obvious that anybody else he'd move in would be an improvement. And obviously, if you do a reshuffle now, you're kind of using up one of the reshuffles you do later when you shift all the teams around, and you begin with people less certain what they're doing. So there's a price to it. David Cameron never liked reshuffles because he always felt, and I thought he was right, really, that you'd be putting in somebody who then would know less than the person you'd removed, and that was a problem. But again, he did use the opportunity of going into power to move Chris Grayling out of the Home Office job and put in Theresa May.
Was that mainly? I'm trying to remember. Was that mainly because he'd said something about gay people in bed and breakfasts during the election campaign? I remember pursuing him around Cornwall during the 2010 election campaign.
But it was also not an opportunity to put a woman into the Home Office, which, David Cameron, plenty of faults like everyone, but, he was interested in those kind of representation issues. He'd made a big play about the A-list as well, trying to, increase the diversity of the Conservative Party. And, Theresa May held that office for a remarkably long time when Labour had struggled to keep anyone in for about 18 months because people kept finding a scandal down the back of the sofa.
Tony Blair's critical reshuffle took place a year into the government, and that's when sort of sheep was sorted out from goats or whatever, and a number of people were dropped, and off he went. Now, I think somebody was saying to me yesterday that Keir Starmer has a slightly different problem, and that is that on his front bench at the moment, there are apparently at least 20 more people than there are jobs available, paid jobs, available in government. Now, this is important because there's an Act of Parliament which specifies how many paid cabinet ministers, how many paid ministers of state, paid parliamentary undersecretary. And that's why if a prime minister wants to, buy people off and, be nice and whatever, by giving them some sort of job, he will often say, you can have the job, but it can't be paid. And I think that there are a lot of people on the front bench who will expect to go into the government, who will, by the way, expect to be paid to be ministers. So he's going to have to filter out quite a few people over the weekend and next week.
And there were aggrieved people, Danny, in 2010, those people who missed out of being in the cabinet because of the coalition being formed. Every job that a Lib Dem took was a job that could have gone to a Tory. And that made a little bit of party management a bit harder.
It did, but at least people did understand why it was happening.
Yeah.
So they understood why they were being excluded, and they didn't have to think, oh, it's because you don't like me. And that's always the most difficult part of reshuffles. People think, everybody who goes into lower ministerial office sort of ends up thinking they could be senior minister or maybe even prime minister. And then when they get dropped, it's very hard psychologically. And one of the ways they deal with it is by saying, you are Prime Minister, a bad person who doesn't agree with me, and that's why you dropped me. And so they then become an enemy. So that's what they've got to try and do, is to make sure they don't make enemies out of people. And that's more difficult in these circumstances.
And if Labour does get a historic landslide and has, 450, 500, 600 of the MPs, that party management job becomes harder because the percentage of people who can have a paid job is obviously much, much smaller.
And then what about in Tony Blair's day, he had to balance the Blairite brownout issue in the cabinet. Every time there was Peter were looking quizzically as if he's never heard this before.
Sorry, what was the problem? What was the problem between the two of them? I really can't remember.
Every time there was a reshuffle, there would be a totting up of Blairites and Brownites and who was on the up. In the coalition years, there was an obvious public issue of Conservatives and Lib Dems. Later, we've had Remainers and Leavers. What are the wings of the Labour Party? He needs
I
to
know
keep
why
happy?
you're saying that, Matt, but it didn't quite happen in that way. I mean, just as people said that when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister, he would draw from the left and from the right of the party, sort of regardless of talent in some cases. Tony was not like that. Tony had no prejudice against sort of the left, the centre-left members, no prejudice against, more obvious Blairite supporters. He really, from about 2 years in, and certainly after 2001, he was literally going for talent. He was going for reformers, modernisers, people. He put in people into the key public service departments who would carry out an agenda of change and reform. They tended to be Blairites, yes. Gordon would have his favourites.
I was going to say, Gordon would often request particular people, wouldn't he?
He would request certain people, and there were one or two people who Tony just felt had failed as ministers and really should sort of make way for others, and Gordon would go in and fight very hard for them and keep them there, and so they went in and out. But in the main, Tony appointed on the basis of talent and ability.
Do you think, which do you think works better? Because basically every May, when the Labour government have a bad set of local election results, we'd have a reshuffle to try and cover that up, which meant there was this constant churn. The coalition was more stable, partly because it was a hassle, but also David Cameron seemed to think it was better. Do you think it was a mistake having those sort of annual reshuffles?
I'm not sure whether they were annual, but they were probably too frequent, and this is a real problem. Obviously, we haven't seen the sort of velocity of ministerial change that we've seen in the last 5-6 years. I mean, literally, not just 5 prime ministers in 10 years, but different ministers heading up particular departments with different agendas, different priorities, almost every 10 minutes. I mean, certainly every year. It's been a disaster for policy making in the country and has really set us back. So I think the best thing for a prime minister is make the really good, best choices you possibly can make, regardless of squaring off this and squaring off that. Get the best people in the jobs and then keep them there and give them time to make a change.
I think there's
Go on, Danny.
Well, I think there's going to be a real problem for Keir Starmer, which is what does everyone who's in Parliament do when they? And the reason why I say that is when there's a massive majority, the attendance doesn't become as important. You can muster a majority without everyone being there. There's no. The number of Labour MPs there are compared to the number of ministerial jobs there are becomes massive. So there's lots of people who not only don't have a job, but can't imagine that they're going to get a chance of a job. This is going to be a hard job for them to manage. I mean, a bit like I joked about the thing of peaking too early. It's a problem that any political party would really love to have, but it is but nevertheless, it's a problem to be managed, and you have to manage the parts of the party. You were talking about Harold Wilson. When Harold Wilson tried to sack Reg Prentice, Roy Jenkins then threatened to resign. So people do, you do have to balance the cabinet, and there are friendships and rivalries and alliances that all have to be balanced, and he'll have to do that as he goes on, but he won't have that right at the beginning. It isn't even obvious at the moment what the division inside Labour will be, and just like in 1997, the Brown-Blair divisions, such as they weren't anywhere near as apparent as they were 3 years later.
Let me talk about people who've got government experience and know their briefs and all that sort of thing, Polly. But all the Lib Dems who went into government in 2010 weren't expected to be ministers, hadn't done all their Institute for Government training and everything else, and some of them made a decent fist of it.
Well, I mean, the shiny example is Steve Webb, who... What?
Well, I just feel like we should ring a bell every time somebody mentions Steve Webb.
Steve Webb, who was a pensions
Who's
expert.
Steve Webb?
Professor Steve Webb. Sometimes I think you don't take this fully seriously, Matt.
No, let's hear more about Steve Webb.
So he was the MP for somewhere like Thornbury and Yate, somewhere in the West Country near Bath. But a pensions expert. He'd worked for the Institute for Fiscal Studies. He knows pretty much more about pensions than anyone else in the country. And he was the pensions minister, built a good relationship with Ian Douglas-Smith, who was Secretary of State for DWP, and, helped to drive through a massive reform to the state pension to bring together the I can't even remember what it's called, the sort of second tier of state pension and the first tier of state pension to massively reduce the amount of means testing, to continue rolling out of auto enrolment. And he knew what he was doing and he did the job really clearly and consistently. You compare that with the kind of extraordinary parade of housing ministers we have had over the last 14 years. And it's no wonder that the country's housing situation is in such a kind of mess. That actually, most people who are in politics have some kind of specialism or interest, an area which they are personally motivated by. And actually, if you can slot people in where they're passionate about making that kind of difference. And actually, Guy Opperman took over within DWP and has been a really solid minister around financial inclusion, around kind of introducing things like the midlife MOT, stuff that doesn't ever kind of penetrate to the top realms of politics because it's being competent. And I think it's interesting. Danny is right about all of those kind of party management issues. But in the end, the best way to manage your party is to be a success in government, actually. Once people feel like they're having to account for you, being embarrassed on the doorstep, having to, go and speak at conferences and being torn to shreds. And so actually investing in your leaders, yes, sending them training at the Institute for Government, giving them areas where they have time to specialise. It is more important to do that than it is to play that kind of party management game.
I'll just take that I completely agree with that, but just to remind you about the person that Tony Blair did appoint in his early reshuffle, which was Frank Field, because he knew all about social security. And the reason why that fell apart was because Frank wasn't just committed to social security in general. He had a particular plan for social security, in my view, very interesting, but also unworkable, both politically and financially, which both Gordon Brown and indeed Tony Blair himself were in fact not in favour of. So they appointed him hoping that he would then come up with something different, which he wasn't going to, because he was committed to the scheme that he was committed to. The thing about, if I may attract you to use the Bell Steve Webb, is that he was, I think, somebody who was more generally intellectual about pensions rather than somebody who was committed to a particular scheme. So if you appoint people who have got, as it were, bees in their bonnet about particular things, that can also be a problem.
In 1997, on polling day, Tony Blair was thinking of appointing Frank Field Secretary of State for Social Security to see through welfare reform policies. And he was toying with this idea. In the end, he didn't. He appointed Harriet Harman as the Secretary of State. Frank went in as Minister for Welfare Reform. There was complete stasis for a year. And during that time, I went in and from the Cabinet Office, where I was Minister without portfolio. I went with David Miliband, who was head of the Number 10 Policy Unit. We went into that department to try and sort out and find some way of breaking the deadlock between these ministers and the standoff between their department and the Treasury, Gordon Brown. We couldn't do it. It didn't happen. And actually, both of them left the government. It was not a happy tale in that first year.
Well, some good warnings from history there for Keir Starmer when he is weighing up if he becomes Prime Minister and is forming a cabinet of what to do and what not to do. Right, up next, we're going to ask the big question. How do you not talk about Brexit, which is what everyone seems to be doing during the entire campaign? Now, we've had lots of messages in over the last few weeks about this. And so we thought, well, in fact, it's only just, a couple of days ago, we passed the 8-year mark since the vote to leave the EU. Rishi Sunak has said a Labour victory will put Brexit in peril. Well, here is Keir Starmer speaking to Harry Cole last night on The Sun's Never Mind the Ballots.
I voted for Remain, but we voted to leave. We're out. I accept that. We're not going back.
Do you not see here?
But we do need... We got a very botched deal. If you talk to any business that's trying to trade, they will tell you it's not good enough. I think we can do more on defence and security, by the way, with our European partners. But we're not going back in. We're not going back into the single market, the customs union. We're not going back to freedom of movement.
Okay, a rare clip of somebody talking about Brexit during this campaign, Polly.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, talking nonsense. I mean, I guess it's not technically nonsense because he's probably saying what he is planning to do. It's just that it's really depressing. You know, Keir Starmer has talked about the first lever he will pull being growth. Well, do you know what would be good for growth? Re-establishing our links with our closest trading partners. It was an act of economic and social self-harm that we did with Brexit. And it is clearer and clearer in the polls, not just that there is now a majority who regret the decision that we made, but also that the demographics mean that as younger people kind of join the electorate and as those who voted for Brexit tend to be older and pass away, the enthusiasm for the European Union in this country is only going to grow. There will come a moment when we need to rejoin the European Union. It probably is the sort of politically correct tactic for Keir Starmer to take, to be so hostile to Brexit, positive about Brexit, in order that he can sort of survive the campaign without that attack by Rishi Sunak kind of landing. But from a kind of future of Britain perspective, God, it makes me despair.
Peter, he says we've got a botched deal and then goes on to rule out doing anything about it.
He didn't actually. He said he ruled out going back into the single market or the customs union. It doesn't mean to say you can't do literally anything about it.
Yeah,
you can try and reduce some of the costs and lower some of the barriers. But frankly, what you can do about Brexit is at the margin. You can't take it on and reverse it. Not for the foreseeable future, not in probably our political lifetimes. And that's a fact.
I'm younger than you, Peter, so I'm not
okay, well, Polly's probably got more to look forward to than me. But the truth is that the public regard Brexit as a sort of dirty great mess, a great pile of poo that's sort of left in the corner, which they don't want to go anywhere near and don't know what to do about. I was on the doorsteps yesterday in Teesside, in Hartlepool and Stockton West supporting Labour candidates. Nobody raised Brexit with me apart from one man, door I knocked on, and he said, "No, I'm not having anything to do with any of you." And I said, "Oh, how are you going to vote then?" He said, "Oh, I'm going to go for Farage." And I said, "What are you going to do with what's Mr. Farage going to do?" "Oh, he's going to make Britain British again." I said, "Well, how's he going to do that?" He said, I said, "Actually, haven't we already done that with Brexit?" He said, "Oh, Brexit," he said, and very purposefully, quietly, firmly closed the door in my face. Look, I do talk about Brexit, Matt. I talked about Brexit on Sunday on the Laura Kuenssberg programme on the BBC.
Yeah, you went on there, didn't mention the podcast.
And, oh, God, marking my homework. And I did talk about it, and I said that with Brexit, which is a self-inflicted harm and wound on us, no question. It's not a one-off. It's a cumulative price that we're going to pay for it, but we can't reverse it. But we can either sink under the weight of it or swim against the tide and do the best we can and reinvent the British economy so that we succeed in the future. And I said, I am a swimmer, not a sinker, to paraphrase a well-known, paraphrase myself. And that's what I think. We are. If you just sort of give up and say, "Oh my God, it's so awful," it's under the weight of the whole thing. There's nothing we can do. You're basically signing away the country's future, and I don't think we have to do that. And I don't think we should.
Let me bring Danny in because the thing that it struck me as being interesting is that an issue
Thanks,
where
Matt.
69% of people say the government's handling this issue badly. More than half of people think the negatives of Brexit have outweighed the benefits. More than half of people think it was the wrong decision to vote to leave the European Union. And yet no one is talking, even the Lib Dems aren't talking. It's interesting from a political perspective that something that overwhelming majority of the public think is bad, no one is talking about it. Danny?
Yeah, well, look, let me, while I shared the view that Brexit was a mistake, I voted Remain, let's try and take this from the perspective of people who didn't, who thought it was a good idea. And there's one strong argument for leaving the European Union, and that is the contention that the European Union would develop itself into a superstate and Britain wanted to remain outside it. Not a ridiculous view, the view taken by Dennis Healey, the view in the 40s, the view taken by Hugh Gateskill in the 1960s. In other words, a view that's been taken on the left as well as on the right and has a degree of evidence behind it. So you can see the argument. What I do not understand is why the Conservative Party, given that it's one of the major things that it did during the last few years, even though I was not in favour of doing it, has not tried harder to promote the benefits of the action that it took. It's a big deal what we've done, right? Of course, Polly would argue that, and Peter are arguing only that it has negatives, and I tend to agree because I wasn't in favour of doing it. But there were very clear arguments that did actually win the day when the referendum was held. So it's not an argument you would definitely lose. So I found it a bit odd that the Conservative Party has run away from something that, if you ask the question, what did the Conservative Party do in office? It could say it did a big consequential thing, and it hasn't tried to defend doing it. So I have found that pretty odd. From Keir Starmer's point of view, I understand entirely. He is trying to build a coalition in which some of the people who are going to vote for Labour are people who voted Brexit, and he doesn't want them to feel he has contempt for their vote and is intending to reverse it. Plus, he himself was never, I mean, in the early days after the Brexit vote, he was never in favour of joining the single market while we remained outside the European Union, because that still is a very tricky policy.
But it's because he was busy campaigning for a second referendum.
He only did that later.
Okay.
So if you look at Keir Starmer's the development of Keir Starmer's view during that Parliament, he first began with the view you couldn't join the single market, and he came round to the view that you should join the customs union. Never endorsed joining the single market. Then moved to the position of a second referendum. He's always had a problem, which is that if we were in the single market but not in the European Union, we'd be rule takers. So it's not a simple matter. If you raised Brexit and said we're going to rejoin the single market, the argument wouldn't stop there. Soon you'd be entangled into all the questions we couldn't answer before 2019. And look what happened to Labour in 2019. It split Labour's coalition. So the people I don't understand why they don't talk about it is the Conservative Party, but Labour, I totally understand why Keir Starmer doesn't want to talk about it.
Nick Clegg was tweeting. Did you see this, Polly?
I did not.
Nick Clegg tweeted, "For the country's sake, I hope Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves succeed in restoring growth to the British economy. But ruling out even the option of joining the EU's custom union on the basis that low growth, which has been the heart of the economic problem in this country for 14 years, started well before Brexit," which is what the Labour Party said. He said, "is a peculiar rewriting of history. The truth is, the UK economy, pandemic aside, suffered two massive shocks in recent times. 2008 financial crisis, in which the economy shrunk by a whopping 6% on Labour's watch," that's you, Peter, and Brexit, which will reduce long-term GDP by around 4%, caused by the Conservatives. There's a middle way. So why aren't the Lib Dems talking about it?
Well, they do somewhere in their manifesto say something about in the long term customs something single market. But it's certainly true they're not making it a major plank of what they are talking about.
I suppose the last time they did that, their leader did lose her seat.
It was, yeah. But everyone's carrying these scars, right? Particularly of the 2019 election, of making it about Brexit. That led to sort of. Because obviously the Lib Dems lost most of their seats in 2015, but in 2019 they had done very well in the European parliamentary elections. They were doing well in the polls. They had, in fact, triggered the general election. So the sense that they then were unable to make any progress in that context, is yet another scar. So everybody's sort of pulling back from it. But I just, it is truly extraordinary to me that, common consensus is that this is a gaping wound in our economy, and what everyone is saying is it's not about putting up with the wound. I don't know, we swim against the wound or something. Peter's metaphor is a bit confusing, but instead of just going to the doctor and getting it stitched up, right? We caused ourselves harm, and it is just seen as a completely obvious political answer to ignore that and make the best of it. Well, can you think of any other piece of economic pain that we would be willing to suffer through for those reasons? It's completely stupid. And going back to my point about the demographics, which is more of a Danny point about the fundamentals of the political maths on this will change over the next 5 and 10 years. And there will be a benefit to the party which decides to actually surf that wave when it comes. But it's not going to happen in the next 9 days.
I'm not underestimating the huge structural damage that Brexit has done to us. I mean, we as a result of Brexit, whatever else we do, however successful we are in riding the technological wave and driving artificial intelligence through our private sector and making it commonplace in our public services as well, both of which things we've got to do, however successful we are in other respects, our economy will be smaller as a result of Brexit. I'm not disputing that. But it is not as simple as you say, just going off and getting the wound stitched up. Because, first of all, because I don't think we can go back to the European Union at any time in any way other than from a position of greater strength than we're in at the moment. We certainly can't go back on bended knee and say, please, please, please take us back. That is not a way. But secondly, the European Union is not going to want to re-engage in the sort of twists and turns and ups and downs and seesaw negotiations they had over so many years with successive prime ministers. It was hell for the European Union, and they are not readily or quickly or easily going to re-engage with that. I can just tell you, my former colleagues in the European Commission, they've got so many other problems on their plate to resolve. And unless and until both parties or all the parties in Britain converge and reach some sort of cross-party agreement or consensus that they want to take Britain in some form back into the European Union, until that agreement exists, they're not going to go resume this sort of game of hokey-cokey with
We don't want to be doing hokey-cokey with a big wound.
And therefore, we've got to make the best of our situation. And one of the ways in which we do so is, yes, building up trust and respect and finding areas in which we can cooperate with our nearest neighbours in the European Union. Yes, try and take the edge and some of the downside off this appalling trade deal that Johnson negotiated with the European Union, but also find other areas in which we can cooperate, like defence and security. Heaven knows, Russia, Putin has revealed to us that we're all in this together in protecting Europe against this guy. So let's find areas of cooperation in that area.
Membership of the European Union is not merely an economic deal. And so you can take the view that we were likely to get a poorer economic deal outside the European Union, but we should still leave it because being a member of the European Union means having a common immigration policy with Latvia, for example. And, if you put that to the electorate, it's surprising it even came second. So if you suggest, anybody who's
Latvia,
anyone who suggests that we plunge back into an argument about Brexit is you cannot assume that the Remain cause would win that, even looking at these polls, any more than it did last time.
And actually, in the interest of balance, I should put out, we've had lots of messages of people saying that Peter says the club has got so much worse since we left. Richard says the Leave vote wasn't about finance, about having the ability to control our borders and make our own decisions, the point that you were making, Danny. John says, I was a big Remainer, but we're never going to rejoin the EU, while the most strident advocates for it aren't making the case from a policy pros and cons point of view. So lots and lots of people getting in touch.
What we should have done, of course, in the first place, was, as many of the Leave campaigners thought, Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage and others, they thought we would and should leave the European Union but remain very, very close to the single market and the customs union, if not in it. They promptly changed their minds. They were so sort of shocked by their own success. And then Theresa May, when she became Prime Minister, made this ludicrous speech to her party conference, trying to sort of, create and embellish her own Leave credentials by putting in place so many red lines. We'll have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the single market. As it happens, when she realised the economic implications of that, she then circled all round and tried to create a deal with the European Union that, on a, quotes, temporary basis that was likely to become permanent, that we would actually have some sort of customs union relationship. But of course, by that stage, I'm afraid, many people, with hindsight in a state of delusion, thought that through the people's vote we could reverse the decision on Brexit. That was the delusional part of it. So nobody wanted it.
But one of those
nobody in that
people
camp
was Keir Starmer.
And one of those people, well, eventually, not immediately.
Yeah.
He was actually.
He was only belatedly delusional.
He was actually more inclined to support Theresa May's deal. And actually, with a lot of hindsight, I too would acknowledge that that would have been better than the outcome that we have.
I said we should back the Theresa May deal at the time, but unfortunately I had no power or authority.
Polly's got her head in her hands. I suspect that we've chased off the very last of our listeners. Let's move on before we all trigger our 2017 PTSD. Up next, some breaking news about the two Tory candidates accused of betting on the general election day. Let's move away from talking about Brexit. Let's bring you
You raised the subject.
I know,
Matt.
and
we didn't.
I'll be honest, about a minute in, I've immediately regretted it.
Let's bit like Brexit.
It was a clever piece of radio. What you were trying to do was for us to demonstrate why the party leaders don't talk.
Yes, it was a piece of performance art in that sense. Let's bring you some breaking news. The Tories have just withdrawn support from the candidates Craig Williams and Laura Saunders after they were implicated in the general election betting round. I've got a WhatsApp here from a Tory party press officer saying, as a result of ongoing internal inquiries, we've concluded we can no longer support Craig Williams or Laura Saunders, the parliamentary candidates, the forthcoming election. We have checked with the Gambling Commission that this decision does not compromise the investigation they're conducting, which is rightly independent and ongoing. Danny, is there a slight sense they possibly might have done this a bit earlier?
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that the reason why they didn't do it earlier is just simply because Rishi Sunak feels a sense of loyalty to Craig. I suspect that's the real reason why it didn't happen, but it was an inevitable thing. You often end up, I mean, I'm sure Peter's seen it lots, you often end up, you don't want to move against people that you know. You want to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Thank you very much. I found exactly the opposite, actually, Dan.
You did, well, I was just thinking that as you said it, and it was sort of extraordinary as an event for that reason. But I think people do find it. They worry about doing those things. So I'm sure that put him off. But he probably should have. Well, he definitely should have realised this wasn't a maintainable situation. 2 or 3 days ago.
Yeah, if you're going to sack someone, you've got to do it faster. There's so much worse to let it drag on and on and on, and then take the sort of the personal pain of betraying a friend and colleague at the end of that.
Well, he's done a whole round of TV debates and all sorts, defending them and explaining why he wasn't suspending them.
But also, Craig Williams was the first person to put his hands up and say, it was a terrible mistake, and I apologise. It wasn't as if you needed a Gambling Commission inquiry to establish the facts.
But yeah, I mean, it's baffling. I think Danny's right. It probably is driven by some positive instincts around loyalty, but I don't know. It just sort of confirms that sense that Rishi Sunak just doesn't actually get politics.
Yeah, why do you want to drip feed all this day in, day out?
Literally no leader about whom you could not say exactly this. Every single leader, from the worst leaders to the most brilliant, has taken several days to make a decision. And my firm prediction is that Keir Starmer will do exactly the same thing. It's very, very easy for us to sit here and say, you should have got rid of somebody 3 days ago. It's not as actually that easy to do it. You feel hesitant morally, you don't know the facts. I've seen it happen again and again.
We did see it with Keir Starmer, didn't we? Over the candidate in Rochdale. They sent people out defending him and then ended up dropping him.
For a day. For a
this
day.
whole time. Exactly. And it didn't, and honestly,
it didn't matter.
If it took 3 days.
Oh, Daddy's cut out there. The IO bot is cut out. Peter, when you've been out on your travels, did you spoke to anyone else?
Well, I would knock on an enormous number of doors yesterday, and what I discovered was the people are not very keen on the Tories.
Right.
They regard Labour as a safe alternative, but they're not quite sure what to expect from Labour. and there are various ex-Tories peeling away and voting for reform. But one thing that really has happened to me that was very exciting was on Sunday morning, and I came back from the BBC and I was just settling down, a nice cup of coffee, when my FaceTime rang on my phone, and I turned it on, and there was a grinning, enthusiastic, happy-looking face of John Prescott. And I thought, has he phoned the wrong
An old friend just having a catch up.
And he said, I'm here, very happy in this home, being well looked after, and they've thrown me some books to read, and I saw yours, and I thought, well, I'm not going to read that, but finally I did, and I realised, having read your book, what the context was, and I was waiting with bated breath. He said, I was unfair to you.
Wow.
I was unfair to you. He said, you cope with all that Brown Blair stuff and they each took it out on you and it's very unfair. And I gave you a good kicking and I'm very sorry and I hope we can be friends.
Wow, that's a nice
story. So nice things do happen in politics.
Nice note to end on.
Yeah.
There we are. Thanks for that, Peter. Peter Mandelson, Daniel Finkelstein, Polly Mackenzie. That was How to Win an Election.